discussing and all of you for attending. So this paper is When Product Markets Become Collective Traps, the Case of Social Media, and it's joint work with Leo Burstein, Ben Handel, and Chris Roth. So there seems to be a paradox in the case of social media use, because on the one hand, people spend a lot of time on social media. The average user, for example, spends 2.5 hours per day. And we have some soft populations that even spend more time. So in this case that we see here of teens spending close to 5 hours per day on social media. And it's not just the time that they spend, but also, we have evidence that people require a lot of money to give up their social media use. All of this, which suggests that people really value these services, or at least that's what the estimates suggest. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have this evidence that social media can cause harm to users. So for example, in this case, the Surgeon General that recently warned that social media was driving mental health problems among teenagers. And we have also evidence, for instance, a paper by Roe, Luca Braieri, and Alexei Makarin, and more evidence suggesting that social media can cause mental health problems to its users. So the question is, how can these two things coincide? How can it be the case that people seem to derive so much benefit for something that harms them at the same time? And there are several explanations. So there's evidence, for example, and some work showing that social media can be addictive. But in this paper, we are going to provide a different explanation that has to do with this screenshot that I am adding here, which comes from this discussion forum Quora. And in this case, this user is saying they have a TikTok account, they would like to delete it, but they are concerned that they are not going to be cool enough. So that's the type of mechanism that we have in mind. And in particular, we argue that individuals might experience negative utility from not consuming a popular product. In the case of social media, being inactive can lead to social exclusion, but more generally, for example, not owning luxury brands can give people low social status. And what we argue is that in the presence of this type of spillovers to non-users, the standard measures that we have that take the aggregate consumption as given are not going to capture appropriately the welfare that is generated by the product. So in particular, users are going to avoid this negative spillover with their purchase, and non-users are going to incur in the negative spillover with their non-purchase. In other words, the relevant outside option to evaluate welfare is going to be the non-existence of the product market. So the framework, what we do is we introduce this concept of non-consumer surplus, which is the utility of not consuming when others are consuming. We're going to relax the standard assumption of zero non-consumer surplus and define what we call the product market surplus, which essentially it's comparing the status quo utility to the case where the product doesn't exist, which is the relevant outside option. And there's going to be two main implications from this relaxation. The first one is that individual consumer surplus is going to overstate welfare whenever there are negative consumption spillovers to non-users. And the second implication is that there can be product market traps, meaning situations where users derive negative welfare but still find it optimal to consume the product when they choose individually. So in these cases, the standard reveal preference type of argument is going to fail. So users are going to be able to derive negative welfare from a product that they choose to consume. And we're also going to argue that the reason why these type of traps can arise in the first place is that a combination of having early adopters and also having network effects, the combination of these two can explain how we can end up in a situation where these type of markets emerge. So in particular, what we do is we propose a new methodology to characterize welfare in the presence of consumption spillovers to non-users. And to implement it, we run pre-registered incentivized online experiments with college students to measure the consumer surplus of TikTok and Instagram. We estimate three objects. One is valuation keeping network, which is the willingness to accept to deactivate your account for 4 weeks, as is standard in the literature to measure welfare on social media. Then we're going to elicit two new objects, which are the valuation removing network, which is just the willingness to accept to deactivate your account when part of your social network also deactivates their accounts. And finally, this object called product market surplus, which is product market valuation, which is the willingness to pay or to accept to deactivate the accounts of all participating students at your own university. So in that sense, the student deciding is going to be pivotal and can decide for everyone at the same time. And what we find, first of all, individual measures of welfare that suggest large positive welfare of social media in line with the literature, and the estimates are in the ballpark of existing estimates. For instance, for Facebook, we find a $50 surplus to deactivate TikTok and Instagram for 4 weeks. Next, this measure of this product market valuation is going to show average negative welfare for users and non-users. And we're going to document what we call the social media trap, where even among users, a large share of them is going to derive negative utility from the product. Finally, we also document large and positive network effects, in particular individual welfare estimates that drop by 1/3 to 1/4 in anticipation of a large fraction of fellow students deactivating their social media, which is going to highlight the importance of these strategic complementarities in the use of social media, what we consider network effects. Okay, so let me go to the conceptual framework. So the standard framework, whenever there are, in the presence of network effects, is going to allow the utility of a user to depend on whatever the others are doing. In this case, suppose that the user can decide, already conditional on joining a platform, the user can decide whether to deactivate or not. We could also relabel this as saying, joining versus not joining. But in this case, the utility of a user not deactivating, so the status quo utility is going to depend on whatever the others are doing. Whether they don't deactivate as well or whether they deactivate is going to change the utility of the product. So this is the standard way of modeling the situation. And typically the assumption is that the utility of not using the product is going to be 0, disregarding whatever it is that the others are doing. Now, what we do is something very simple, which is we just relax this assumption that the utility, when the user is deactivating the platform or not joining the platform, we're not going to impose the assumption that this utility is equal to 0. So we're going to allow it to have a flexible value. We're only going to impose the kind of like the minimum normalization required, which is assuming that the utility of the case where everybody is outside of social media, that is equal to 0. Now, allowing for this non-consumer surplus to be different from 0 is going to capture, for example, a fear of missing out, or potentially status preferences or positional externalities. So any situation where, for instance, the user is going to get some utility from being, for instance, highly ranked or highly respected and so on among their peers. In the case when there is a negative non-consumer surplus, which is going to be, as we show, the relative case in our setting, there are going to be two implications from having this negative non-consumer surplus. The first one is that the standard measures of welfare are going to overstate welfare. So in particular, individual consumer surplus, which compares utility when, the status quo versus utility when only the user is removed from social media. This is going to be bigger than the utility of the status quo relative to the case where the product doesn't exist, which is a more policy relevant object because this reflects really the utility that users are getting from the platform. That's the first implication. And the second one is that there can be product market traps in a similar way in which, for instance, this seminal paper showed that there can be traps where users, in this case, could be trapped in an inferior technology. In our case, it's a similar implication, but these traps are being generated by a different mechanism, which in our case, we're going to provide some evidence of the fear of missing out. But what we mean by product market traps is cases where users are going to individually prefer to use the platform. So their consumer surplus is going to be positive. So that means that, when holding constant whatever the others are doing, it's going to be beneficial or optimal for the user to choose to not deactivate their platform. At the same time, they would be better off without the platform. So if they could coordinate with everybody else to deactivate, they would. So they would prefer to be in this situation, but it's just that they cannot coordinate with everybody else to arrive to this point. And so there's going to be a sort of prisoner's dilemma, but in the case of social media. And again, as I told you, in the paper, we discuss in a bit more detail how the presence of early adopters and positive network effects can explain why this product emerges in the first place.
Rafael, there's a question from Luis.
Yes.
What does negative consumer surplus mean? Usually we think about the difference between utility from buying and utility from not buying, like a unilateral decision, which in this case should be positive because of your assumptions.
Yes. So in this case, exactly. So in this case, the usual consumer surplus, or the idea that we have, so the idea that we have in mind usually is that we understand for consumer surplus just the comparison of me when I get something versus me when I don't get something. And in this case, negative consumer surplus just means that if we compare, for example, the utility of me using or me being in the status quo to the case where nobody is using the platform, this is going to be negative. So what we mean by negative is of course a comparison relative to this case where nobody's using the platform, which we normalize to 0. So that's the meaning of negative. It's relative to the relevant outside option, which in this case is where the product doesn't exist.
And I guess a follow-up question
from just
Luis. Go ahead.
It's not what we normally call consumer surplus. That's all. It's just a matter of terminology.
Totally. And by the way, I'm having some issues with my connectivity, so things arrive in a little bit delayed. So if I don't respond very quickly, that's the reason why. But yeah, absolutely. So that's why we are calling this the product market valuation in the paper, to be more precise. So that's going to be our measure of welfare, that we believe that it's more policy relevant and that more accurately captures the welfare that people derive from the product. And individual consumer surplus is going to be as we say here, that's going to be the standard measure that we consider to be consumer surplus, which is me individually consuming versus not consuming.
I guess as a follow-up to Luis, and maybe this is a longer conversation for later, but because this is a non-standard outside option, right? We need to be careful in sort of evaluating when we should use this non-standard outside option and when we should go with the framework that we've used traditionally.
That's a fantastic point. And indeed, for example, if we want to conduct some sort of partial equilibrium analysis where we're trying to evaluate, for example, how would a user be, how would this user be affected when we just deactivate, for example, their social media for a certain amount of time, individually of, disregarding whatever others are doing. In that case, the standard consumer surplus might be the right measure that we want to look at. But when we want to conduct some policy analysis, for example, and we want to understand really the welfare that is being generated by social media websites, in that case, we might want to use instead the product market surplus.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is great points. Thank you for the questions. Okay, so let me continue. So how do we implement this in practice? So the sample is we're going to recruit close to 1,000 college students through a partnership with College Pulse. And we do this both because this is policy relevant. So there have been proposed bans of social media in the context of colleges. And actually, some colleges have already begun to ban some social media websites. And there's also in this population is where a lot of the studies are documenting these mental health problems. So we do this for that reason. And also in practice to have a large overlap in people's networks, we want to capture a setting where, you know, in that setting, there's a substantial amount of people's, the people relevant network. So in this case, for example, in our service, 58% of the friends of their Instagram friends of our subjects are going to be fellow students. So we believe that this setting captures a substantial portion of their networks. There's some selection, of course. So, you know, we told people that we require them to provide their handles to participate in this study, because we needed to verify, whenever we were conducting the activation, we needed to verify compliance. And some people were, you know, not willing to participate, a few of them because of privacy concerns, and a few others because also of the fear of missing out. So in that sense, we can think that we're not capturing even potentially some of the ones that suffer the most extreme type of fear of missing out, because we're not capturing these people who didn't even participate in the first place. We're also going to exclude participants who fail attention checks or who regret their final evaluation. So we're going to give them an opportunity to regret whether these valuations actually reflected their true valuations, and we're going to exclude them from the analysis. And of course, we run some robustness checks, also including these other people. So the final sample that we have is close to 300 TikTok users and 230 Instagram users. We also have some non-users, so 300 non-users for TikTok and very few in the case of Instagram. This difference is caused mainly by platform popularity. So Instagram is super popular in this setting, and you know, mostly everyone has an Instagram. So we proceed in essentially 4 steps. So there's an initial baseline step where we conduct a price elicitation with an example product good to have people be accustomed to the experience and to the instructions. The way that we elicit the evaluations is going to be combining a Becker-de-Groot-Marchak elicitation. So we randomly draw an offer, and we combine this with an iterative multiple price list. So instead of asking people directly, you know, how much do we need to pay you to deactivate social media, we ask them a series of binary questions to decide between different amounts, just because we thought that it was going to be cognitively better to understand, easier to compare between a series of binary questions. And as I told you, we conduct an example elicitation, hypothetical, where we ask them if they would be willing to deactivate their Uber account for 4 weeks. Then we proceed with the first step, and in this case, we elicit this object valuation keeping network, where we measure individuals' willingness to accept to deactivate their accounts for 4 weeks. And this represents the standard individual measure of welfare, which, as we were discussing with Luis, this is the measure of consumer surplus that we are used to. So this compares the status quo to the case where I don't use the product individually. After this, we introduce them to the possibility of conducting a large-scale deactivation study. So we ask participants to consider 2 options that we're going to have for this large-scale deactivation. And we tell them that one of these options will be randomly implemented if we manage to recruit more than 2/3 of the students at their university. Of course, what we needed was that individuals believed that there was some likelihood that for incentive compatibility, some likelihood that this deactivation could in the end up being implemented. We elicited their beliefs of what do they think was the chances that we would conduct this large-scale deactivation, and the average belief was pretty high at 45% that we were going to conduct it. And moreover, to increase credibility, we told participants that we were using this panel, College Pulse, this recruiting company whose panel exceeds 650,000 university students, that we were targeting universities with high penetration, and also that we had seen previous deactivation studies that had a very high compliance rate. And so the first option for this large-scale deactivation is this valuation removing network. So we measure the individual's willingness to deactivate their account when a large fraction of their social reference group has already deactivated. So we tell people, imagine that we ask people sequentially whether they want to deactivate or not. Suppose that all of the previous participants have already agreed to deactivate their accounts. How much would we need to pay you to also deactivate your accounts? So in this case, the interpretation of this object is that we're comparing the utility when, suppose, take it to the extreme, suppose that nobody else is on the social media, the case where I'm the last person surviving on social media relative to the case where nobody else is on social media. Of course, we're not removing the whole world from social media, so this can be interpreted as a case where we remove a substantial part of the network. And the difference between this object that we compute in this step and the first object is going to allow us to quantify the size of the network effects. And this is based on a definition based on strategic complementarities. That is, whether other users, the presence of other users is going to increase my marginal utility from using the platform. So how much is my extra utility from joining when the others are in the platform, as compared to the case of my utility of joining when nobody else is there. So this difference is going to tell us the strength of these strategic complementarities. And finally, yes, please.
Sorry, quick question. Do we know in general what is the share of, I guess you can infer it from your calibrations, but what is the share of friends that come from college for these college students versus other environments? I'm thinking high school or where they were raised and born, or even social influencers.
Yeah, the only thing that we asked them was this question of what fraction of their Instagram friends were fellow college students, and it turns out that it's 58%. We did this in this elicitation of the case of Instagram. We don't have it in the case of TikTok, so this was based on some feedback that we got after the first experiment. So one issue with the interpretation of this finding, we don't want to say that that we are removing 58% of this X, because it could be the case that what matters is not necessarily, for instance, the interaction with other people directly on social media. So it's not that we necessarily need to be friends on TikTok, for example, for your use of TikTok to influence my use of TikTok. It could be that you saw a video and we talk about this video offline and so on. So it's a little bit tricky to use the online friendships as a raw measure of what is going to be the influence of others' use. But at least this measure of Instagram gives us a sense that there is substantial overlap.
I guess the question comes from the fact that, if the rest of the valuation comes from other parts of the network, then you're underestimating these social traps. If instead it's coming from intrinsic value of like maybe social influencers, then that's the estimate. Totally.
No. And I do think that, certainly some fraction of valuation comes from, you follow Taylor Swift on these platforms and so on, people that we are actually not removing from using this exercise. We try to get a little bit of that with a qualitative question, asking people to extrapolate a little bit what would happen in more extreme scenarios. But that's the best that we can do to capture that, because it would be hard to deactivate Taylor Swift from social media.
I agree.
Okay, so in this third step, for incentive compatibility purposes, respondents are told that one will be randomly selected to decide whether the deactivation study is implemented. So this person is going to be the pivotal student, and what we needed is for this randomly chosen student, if they didn't comply with the deactivation, that they didn't receive any payment, and also that the deactivation study ends for everyone. So we really wanted to compare a case where either everybody deactivates or nobody deactivates, not kind of like in between comparisons. Also, respondents are told that other students will receive just enough money such that they're willing to deactivate their accounts. And here we wanted to prevent, for example, people believing that we were going to pay them above their valuation or not enough to prevent these other types of, or to reduce at least this other type of motivations. So we wanted them to believe that the other ones were going to be indifferent, essentially, between deactivating and not deactivating. We verify all of these with attention screeners. So in this third step, we measure the willingness to deactivate everyone for 4 weeks. In the first question, so we set the offer, the initial offer. Remember that we're asking people binary questions. So in the first offer, we set this offer equal to 0 to place people in positive or negative territory. And then subsequent questions are going to randomize the offer to either increase or decrease the offer to be able to place their valuation in whether it's a willingness to accept or a willingness to pay for deactivating. This elicitation, as I mentioned before, is going to allow us to measure consumer surplus, accounting for consumption spillovers, or as we said, maybe we don't want to call it consumer spillovers, so product market valuation, comparing the status quo to the case where the product doesn't exist. The findings. So there we see large positive individual consumer surplus for TikTok and Instagram in line with previous research, slightly higher in the case of TikTok. The second finding is that we see large positive network effects. So this is how much the valuation drops once I find out that a substantial part of my network is also off social media. 1/3 to 1/4 of a drop we see once we deactivate the others. So again, this going back to Chiara's point, there still remains some surplus from using social media in this case, and we can interpret this as, once everybody else is out, I still have some surplus, and this could be, for instance, because I like to see Taylor Swift and she's still there, so that's why this second bar doesn't drop to 0. And finally, in this third step, valuation turns negative. In the case of TikTok, it dropped to -28. And in the case of Instagram, it dropped to -10. And again, this measure indicates negative welfare on average. This was for the case of users. Once we include non-users, these estimates drop even more. So suggesting, that non-users are also willing to pay to have the others be excluded from social media. Now, when we look at the extensive margin, we see a large fraction of users that derive negative welfare. So in the case of TikTok, 64% of them were deriving negative welfare. This is higher once we include non-users. In the case of Instagram, it's close to the majority, and we have essentially very few non-users. So it's close to the majority of users deriving negative welfare, which is what we call the product market trap. Now, for robustness, we do several robustness checks. So we, for instance, different sample definitions, including inattentive people or regretters. Also, because our estimates, because of the multiple price list, essentially they place valuations in buckets or on ranges. They might be sensitive of what we assume at the endpoints, because in the endpoints, you have from a certain valuation to plus infinity or a certain valuation to minus infinity. And it might be the case that these estimates are sensitive to this assumption. We impose, for instance, different assumptions, whether at the endpoints there's a triangular distribution that continues the spreads over a little bit of the mass, or a uniform distribution, and the estimates remain pretty much the same. We also conduct hypothetical questions, such as, for instance, a ranking question where we ask people to rank different scenarios, and results seem to be pretty much the same in these hypothetical questions. I'll show you one of them in the next slide. And also robustness to credibility. So, as I told you, there was a high perceived likelihood of conducting the large-scale study, and we're going to see that valuation is even more negative for people who think that it's more likely that we're conducting it, which suggests that the elicitation might be conservative. So this hypothetical question that I told you is we were asking people whether they would like to live in a world without these platforms. And the reason why we ask this question is, first of all, because all of these machinery of using the BDM and you draw a random offer and all that can be quite difficult to understand. So we wanted something easier and to see whether participants we saw the same patterns with this simple question. And also, as we were talking earlier, we cannot deactivate all of the influencers and so on. So in a way, this is a way to extrapolate a little bit to that case where we can also, in a hypothetical scenario, where we could also deactivate influencers and so on. And we see similar patterns in this case. So we see, for example, that for TikTok users, 1/3 of them prefer to live in a world without the platform. For Instagram users, it's above the majority that prefer to live in a world without the platform. We see similar patterns for a hypothetical ranking where most people prefer the activation of everyone over only themselves deactivating and nobody deactivating. So confirmed with another hypothetical. We also see that the product market valuation on average is negative for respondents who stated that they prefer to live in a world without the platform, and it's positive for participants who prefer to live with the platform, which suggests that, you know, at least these measures, these hypothetical measures and our measure, it's going in the same direction. In terms of credibility, the point estimate is more negative among those who have a higher belief that the activation is going, the large scale deactivation is going to take place. Now, in terms of mechanisms, I see that I still have some time, so let me talk about mechanisms. It could be the case that this drop in welfare is fully driven by factors such as repugnance towards digital products, because we have seen a lot of discussion about big tech, for example. So it could be that, you know, participants just hear big tech and they automatically dislike anything that has to do with big tech, or, you know, this a study about big tech and there's some experimental demands. They think that, you know, we're against big tech, and so on. So to rule this out, we run essentially an identical design, but with a digital product. So still among digital products, but a case where plausibly there's less pronounced non-consumer surplus. In this case, it's the case of Google Maps, for example. So navigation and smartphone apps. So we believe that nobody is getting FOMO from your friends being on Google Maps, for example. And in this case, when we run the same elicitation, we see that the estimates of the product market surplus are positive, large, and highly significant, which suggests that at least, you know, the negative product valuation that we find is not fully driven by these mechanical factors, such as the way that we frame our elicitation or this type of repugnance. We also asked people some open-ended questions to try to understand a little bit better what was the reason underlying this negative valuation. So, for instance, among those who prefer to live in a world without the platforms, we asked them, why do you still use it? And we asked them to just, you know, an open-ended question, and we hand-coded this open-ended question manually and also confirmed with ChatGPT. And we find, for example, that responses that are more consistent with a fear of missing out, such as people, for instance, mentioning, I don't want to be excluded, and so on, they tend to be the main reason that people mention in the case of TikTok and Instagram. And as I told you, in the case of maps, I mean, we have very, very few people that say that they would prefer to live in a world without maps. But among those, you know, nobody mentions anything that has to do with fear of missing out. We do see what I was talking earlier at the beginning. We do see evidence of addiction. So, you know, addiction could play a role in explaining this paradox that I told you of a lot of valuation, while at the same time people being harmed. But it doesn't seem to be the main driving factor in these two platforms. We also asked people, how would you feel if you were the only one who deactivated this platform and everybody else kept using it? And again, we see some evidence of fear of missing out in the case of social media platforms. In the case of Google Maps, people just tend to mention, for example, I will feel bad, but no mention of being excluded from everybody else or some indication that they're having a fear of missing out. All of this to say that we have some evidence that, you know, fear of missing out and these type of mechanisms could be driving the negative valuations. Okay, so we also went a little bit outside social media and we tried to see whether these results generalize to other settings where we could still have this type of negative consumption spillovers. So in this case, for example, we fielded some surveys asking people about luxury goods, and we wanted to see whether we find the same pattern of traps in the case of luxury goods. So we measure, for example, whether people who own luxury brands would also prefer to live without these brands. So we ask them, again, the same hypothetical questions. Do you prefer to live in a world with or without these brands? And among brand non-owners, so people who haven't bought these brands for themselves, we see that they would like to, you know, ban this type of luxury brands like Gucci and so on. But even among owners, we see this pattern that the users themselves would prefer to not have these type of products. We go not only looking for luxury brands, but also looking, for instance, vintage goods. It could be the case that products market traps manifest, for example, not just as excessive consumption by users, but as the production of an excessive number of product variations of vintages, such as this seminal paper on product vintages. So, continuously, Apple, for example, just launching new products, trying to get people to own the latest product. So we asked people to rate whether they would prefer to live in a world where Apple releases the iPhone in a lower frequency. And this is the percent of respondents that prefer to live in a world where the iPhone is released every other year rather than every year. And we can understand that, for instance, Android users would like, to have a little bit lower frequency, but even among iPhone users, we see the same pattern that they would like to slow down the launching of these vintages. So, okay, I have just 3 minutes left, which is enough to conclude. We developed a new methodology to measure welfare with consumption spillovers to non-users. We provide evidence of this social media trap, where even among users, the majority of respondents derive negative utility from the product, while still having large individual welfare with the standard measures of consumer surplus. But at the same time, we find evidence of large positive network effects. This goes beyond social media, so we see the same pattern in luxury goods and vintage goods. And just in terms of policy implications, there might be, for instance, antitrust implications where there could be welfare gains, for instance, from reducing the network size, and also potentially banning features that increase non-consumer surplus. So, this pattern that we find means that platforms could increase their consumer base not by making the product better, but simply by essentially making the cost of not using the product, making it larger. And for example, one way to do that is, in the case of iPhone, for example, you want to signal very clearly who is not on iPhone. And there's evidence that there's a negative stigma against those who have, whenever you text somebody and they reply to you and you see a green bubble and in a different color for Android users, that, this might increase the cost of being a non-user, and without really adding a lot of benefit from using the product, but just increasing the cost of being a non-user. So we might want to revisit this type of features that don't really add much welfare. Thank you very much, and looking forward to hear the discussion and questions.
Wonderful. This was fascinating. Thank you, Rafael. There's a question in the chat from Andre, but we'll leave it for the Q&A. Now, Roy, take it away for your discussion.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me to discuss this paper by such an amazing group of co-authors. I was told not to summarize it, so I'm going to go straight to my 3 points. I will discuss how topical this paper is, what I see as potentially one limitation, and the broader implications that I think this paper has, and I think it has really broad implications. So first, let me start by saying that this is a really great paper, and it asks an important question. It's executed really well. Like, if you read the details, I think Rafa mentioned some of this, like the willingness to pay questions are all worded super carefully. It's transparent. You can see the actual survey instrument. I looked into the survey. So, I mean, it's not surprising, but it's really done properly. It's written well. And I think, most importantly, it answers a very relevant and large question. And I say this is relevant because, let me provide one example. I think these interventions are actually taking place. So the best example maybe is smartphone use among kids. There's a greater concern now that smartphones might cause various harms. The evidence is still suggestive, and many parents want to maybe not withhold smartphones from their kids, but they can't do it because they can't have the one kid being like the outcast in his class or whatever. And what we're recently seeing more and more of is communities deciding collectively to withhold smartphones, whether it's classes of parents in Israel, neighborhoods in Spain, or even an entire town sometimes. So one example is in Eastern Ireland, there's the town of Greystone that made a decision that no kid is going to get, it was a voluntary pact, but kind of the parents signed this pact that no kid will get a smartphone until they reach secondary school. And it was such a huge success that it's now discussed as a potential national policy. Now, what I think this paper does is it shows we've been trying to kind of talk about digital detox for a while, but these interventions seems to be the one with the most potential. And this paper shows why they have the most potential. Because in essence, we're facing a coordination problem. And the only solution for a coordination problem is to coordinate among parents, classes, neighborhoods, teachers, whatever, and to solve this problem together, and thus increase everyone's welfare. And I think maybe the next step is actually to start studying some of these real-world interventions. And that brings me to my second point. So I think this paper is really great, but there is one limitation, which I think is worth discussing. Again, not because I want to discuss the limitation in this paper, but I think it has broader influences, which is that even though this experiment is incentivized, no one actually received the incentives. In other words, people's decisions on the willingness to pay, the answers never actually made any difference. Now, and it didn't make a difference because remember, the authors said that only if they reach 2/3 of students, they will implement the decision, and they never actually reached 2/3 of students, and we could have predicted that they won't reach 2/3 of students. Now, the authors make a real effort to make this seem as incentivized as possible. They actually collect the TikTok handles and the Instagram handles, and they say that they're going to follow these students later and see that they deactivated. So there's a real effort going on here, which I appreciate, but this effort doesn't lead to actually these incentives being realized. And then the question is, does it matter that people's decisions won't have an effect on the decision? And Rafa argued maybe it doesn't matter because people thought that there's a 45% chance that the authors will reach enough students. But I'm not sure that's enough, because the real question is, what did people perceive will be the impact of the decision? And remember, we have to reach 2/3 of students, but also we need the students to believe the authors. We need the students to think, what is the probability that I will be chosen as the pivotal student, kind of the dictator deciding for everyone? And finally, will the authors even have the option to collect this money later? Suppose I'm willing to pay $30. I doubt that you took the credit card details, right? So it's kind of like, if I'm doing this survey, I'm thinking there's no way I'm actually going to pay these $30. Now, I want to highlight that this isn't a criticism on this paper specifically. I think generally, where we currently are in econ is the most willingness to pay papers. They're only implemented for like 1 to 5% of participants. And this paper, it's 0%, but people think it's 5%, so maybe that's the same. But I think as a profession, we have to ask ourselves, does it really matter that these incentives take place? If not, let's just ask stated answers, like kind of stated preferences, and that's fine. I'm not saying anything against that. If they do matter, does it matter if it's 1% or 10% or 100%? And if those differences matter, then we need to do something a bit different. So I think this is for future studies, not this work, but it's one question we have to ask ourselves as a profession. And I should say, I'm also running these kind of experiments, and I also only implement them for 1% of the participants. So again, this is nothing against this paper specifically, but I think it's a good opportunity to discuss these broader issues. And I want to finish again on a more positive note, that I think Rafa was talking about kind of other implications, luxury markets, etc. But this paper, I think, has even broader implications in two senses. One, it's not only about the extensive margin. That is, it's not only about whether I use a product or not. It's also about how much I use it. And this is especially relevant for social media. And I think you can easily extend your model. Again, I don't think this should be in this paper, but to discuss this intensive margin. And two, you discuss consumer goods, but actually you can think that this is relevant in other markets as well. And again, I'll just provide one example. Think of the labor market. You can imagine a scenario where many people work more hours than what they would have liked to work, but they cannot, but as long as other people work longer hours, they will get disutility from working fewer hours, right? They will never be the one who gets promoted. They will look bad compared to their colleagues. So we might actually be stuck in a labor market trap that we can't escape. And if that's the case, this actually provides justifications for policies like the French 35-hour work week. Right? And most economists can be kind of critical against this kind of regulation, but actually Rafa's framework shows that this regulation can increase most people's welfare and lead to a general increase in aggregate welfare. So I guess to conclude, I would say that both the model and the methods discussed in this paper are critical for the way we think of economic questions, and I think we need much more work kind of following this paper. Thanks a lot.